We left off talking about all of the component parts of the Roman city, and I think today it behooves us to go back to Rome and look at what has happened in this period between the collapse of the Republic in the 1st century BCE up until the point where the Emperor Constantine moves the capital of the Roman world from Rome to what is now Turkey, to Istanbul, then called Nova Roma, New Rome, subsequently renamed Constantinople about 100 years later, and then later changed to Istanbul. This is a model of Rome at about that time, around 300 of the Common Era, showing Rome. This was built by architecture students in the 1930s originally, and it is constantly being updated at a museum of Roman civilization in a place just outside Rome called the Eur, E-U-R, to use the English. They call it Eur. The view that we see here, just to point out where we are, is the crossing of the river here, the Capitoline Hill that we see here, the Palatine Hill, and the part of the Palatine where Rome began, presumably, according to legend, called the Germalis. The valley in between, that was originally a swamp, became the Forum. And then up here on these hills that we see, here the Quirinal, Viminal, and Esquiline that we see over here. The site of the Colosseum was actually also a swamp and actually was converted by the Emperor Nero into a kind of private park for himself. Ultimately, his house was confiscated by the Roman state. The property was then turned back to the Roman people, and his successor, the Emperor Vespasian, constructed this enormous arena, this enormous amphitheater that we know as the Colosseum, because it was associated with a giant statue of Nero, a colossus, and it actually took its name from an English monk named Bede, or Bede, B-E-D-E, in the writing in the 8th century of the Common Era. We notice then the large sort of public buildings, and what I want to focus on today is the expansion of the Forum in the imperial period over here into these imperial fora, again going back, and then you'll notice the aqueducts and so forth that are actually bringing water supply in. Now, once those aqueducts came into a holding basin, the pipes then were aligned to the streets. But the streets did not conform to the water supply, and we'll make that contrast when we see pre-Islamic cities in the Arabian world, North Africa, and so forth, that where the water supply actually is the streets follow the water supply. In this case, the water supply follows the streets. We'll begin with the Palatine. The shaded area that you see is the area known as the Germalis, and it was here under that grove of trees that we see at the lower part that we now believe was the site of the Lupercal and so on. This was a residential area going all the way back to the time of Augustus, and he bought property in the early part of the 1st century of the Common Era, and he built his own house there adjacent to his wife's house. And that set a precedent then that all subsequent emperors lived on the Palatine. His successor, Tiberius, who was his stepson actually, built an enormous palace here that was then never excavated, that was later enlarged by the Emperor Caligula. It actually means little boots. Caligula was a madman, was crazy. And he was succeeded by Claudius, who was a decent guy, and then ultimately by Nero, who the end of the Julio-Claudian hereditary imperator, or monarchy, basically came to an end with Nero. Actually came to an end with his successors, with Domitian. I'm getting ahead of myself. In any event, during the 100s, from about 100 to about 200, to 180 precisely, the emperors were actually appointed, and these were called the adopted emperors, because what they would do is find someone who was a very promising student somewhere, and then they would train them to be the emperor, right? Now, they did not call this an empire. We call it an empire. The word empire comes from a very common word that you're familiar with from your grade school English, right? It's an imperative, right? Meaning, hand me the pencil, a command. And it's the Latin word that means to command. So the title was actually princeps, prince, the first citizen, princeps, the first citizen of Rome. But they did not ever call themselves an empire. As far as they were concerned, they were still a republic, although it was a republic that as time wore on became more and more and more like a hereditary monarchy. From here then, after Tiberius and Nero, and Nero's property all down in here is confiscated by Vespasian. Vespasian's son Domitian constructs an imperial residence on the Palatine adjacent to the house of Augustus. And it really consists of two parts that we'll see in detail in a moment. The first part was the official, sort of the west wing of the imperial residence, which was called the Domus Flavia. And the second part was the residential part of the complex, which was called the Domus Augustana. It was then added to a couple of hundred years later by the Severans, who added a bath complex and some entertainment areas and so forth. They lived up on this hill almost like gods, you know. The whole hill, the entire hill became forever from this point forward, all the way up to the fall of Rome, when Odoacer, the Ostrogoth, is actually living in this imperial residence. So here are the three sort of phases that we see today in the archaeological record. These are the two complexes that we see here. The first is on your left, and that is under that roof is the house of Augustus, very modest. And then we see this enormous palace here in two parts that was constructed by Domitian around 86 to 90 of the Common Era. It is organized exactly like the Roman Domus, exactly like the single-family house, only it is writ very, very large. He had his own basilica, which was over here. The atrium here says tablinum, or throne room, where he would meet with various officials and so on. And then this, the peristyle, and the triclinium, this enormous room which was for state dinners and so on and so forth, heated by a hypocaust. In reverse, we see that here in the Domus Augustana, with a kind of an atrium that opened out into a box overlooking, a private box overlooking the Circus Maximus. And then here, this sort of large peristyle garden and a residential compound that we see here. There was also some buildings right in here. One was a school called the Pedagogium. And this was a sort of school for the people who were attached somehow to the retinue of the imperial family. This large area that we see over here, often called the Hippodrome, was actually an entertainment area. And the apse that we see, the semicircular thing on its right, was actually a two-story dining room. So you could think of this as a place where you would have jugglers and clowns and dancing bears and so forth, entertainment at dinner time. And then this is the bath complex built by the Severan dynasty in about 200 of the Common Era. Now, during this period, or just after the palace of Domitian, the Domus Flavia and Domus Augustana is built, and actually beginning just before it, were a series of, they sort of outgrew the forum, and there were a series of imperial fora that were constructed adjacent to the Republican Forum. Just for your reference, this is the site of the Comitium and the Curia, the original Curia. Julius Caesar had begun actually to rearrange this and had constructed a new Curia here, which is known as the Curia Julia, completed by Augustus, his successor. And he had started to construct his own forum that we see here, the Forum of Julius Caesar. So what this begins to show us is that we have on the left the Curia Julia, the Basilica Julia at number 35, completed by Augustus, which was a new law court. The renovation of number 5, which was the old Basilica Fulvia Aemilia, the removal of the comitium, and the construction of a new curia at number 8, to which then Julius Caesar, the dictator, actually built his own forum. This, probably as much as anything, combined with the fact that he brought back Cleopatra, who had borne him a son, the Queen of Egypt, after or before the war with Egypt, and he lived with her openly. I don't know what his wife Calpurnia thought about that, but Caesar was not a very nice guy. And ultimately, this is sort of then his assassination, and then a period of civil war, and then ultimately the beginning of the imperial age in 27 BC. This forum, the Forum of Caesar, was completed by his successor, Augustus. Again, the gray buildings are the old Republican period buildings, some which actually go back to the regal period, such as at the lower, number 45, the Regia, the Temple of Saturn at 23, and then the Republican buildings of the Comitium and the Temple of Castor and Pollux. This is a reconstruction of the Forum of Julius Caesar. It was very influential for a number of people, including Thomas Jefferson, although he never saw it. This is the comparison then to his plan for the University of Virginia. You'll notice the position of a library in the center, which is in the form of the Pantheon, and then along the sides, these pavilions were intended to represent all the various disciplines, which were now united not by an imperial power, but by knowledge, thus the library. In 2 BC, Augustus constructed the Temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger. In it, as we'll see, he placed the Temple of Mars, god of war, and if you download this, you can read it, a statue of a kind of Hall of Fame of Romans, in which he placed his dead uncle, himself, Aeneas, Romulus, the whole thing. The message is clear. I am the second founder of Rome. I am the savior of the Republic. He was probably the greatest politician and propagandist that ever lived, because he was able to do two amazing things. Convince everybody he was restoring the public on the one hand, while he was setting up an hereditary monarchy on the other. That's a pretty good trick if you can pull that off. He did it. He was only 18 years old when he began his career. It's amazing, actually. Ruled for a very, very, very long time. So we look at this, and what we see is orthogonal to the Forum of Caesar. Here's the new curia. The comitium would have been in front of that. And then we see the orthogonal relationship here to the Temple of Mars Ultor, with this kind of double apse that contained this Hall of Fame of Romans. And then to the south of that, Vespasian built what he called the Forum of Peace. It contained within it a series of gardens, public gardens, along with public libraries that we see here. The map was added by Septimius Severus a couple hundred years later, and the reconstruction is slightly wrong in that by the time that Septimius would have added this map, the Romans were no longer using scrolls. They had invented the codex, which we know of as the book, bound together, okay? Codex. The map turns out to be surprisingly accurate. It is today only in fragmentary form, and not a whole lot of it remains, but it is remarkable that created this enormous map of Rome. In between the Forum of Vespasian that we see here and the Temple of Mars Ultor, the Forum of Augustus that we see here, the Emperor Nerva, the first of these adopted emperors, who set up this system of the 5 good emperors, constructed what is called the Forum Transitorum, and in it he placed a temple to Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. Now you'll notice here the sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, then had to be reconstructed and moved around the temple, right? There you see it passing on down into the Republican Forum and eventually out through the Velabrum and into the Tiber. The sort of granddaddy of all of these imperial fora, and the last one to be constructed between about 110 and 126 of the Common Era, was the Forum of Trajan. It's a really remarkable building. The architect, we actually know who the architect was. He was a Syrian. not from Assyria, but he was a Syrian, Apollodorus of Damascus, a heck of an architect. And each one of these fora then contained within it a facility. This one was actually labeled a basilica, although the Senate would often convene in the forum of Julius Caesar, or in the forum of Augustus, or in the forum of Vespasian. It also consisted of markets, which we will come to in a moment, and a Latin library on the west and a Greek library on the right. These are existing buildings. And then a presumed temple to Trajan that was built here by his successor, Hadrian, although no evidence of this temple has ever been found. The column, however, which is what I really want to focus on in the center, Trajan's column, has stood all this time, 2,000 years. And in every city at some point, St. Petersburg in Russia, Paris, for example, in the Place Vendôme, Chicago in Burnham's plan of 1909 seems to want to have one of these columns. That's the last time we will see it. It was never built. So what we have then is this old Republican forum here associated with the Rome's original founding, the law courts, the legislative bodies, and so forth. And then in the imperial age, this expansion outward into these extremely large fora that we see here, often referred to as the imperial forum. This is the forum of Trajan. There we see the Basilica Ulpia, the Greek and Latin libraries, and then the column, which doubled as his tomb. His ashes were placed there. Well, if there was a prohibition against burial in the city, how could you get around that? They adopted the practice of the Egyptian pharaohs. They deified them, and therefore they could be buried inside the pomerium. Then up here, benched into the hill, going up toward in this case, the Viminal Hill, is actually this elaborate market building, which had a duplicate over here on the other side, which no longer remains. This is a reconstruction drawing of the large courtyard with an equestrian statue of the emperor in the center, looking toward the basilica, which was placed in a transverse direction. And this is the column as it exists today. It was actually built as a war memorial. And what you see here is the triumph of Trajan against the Dacians. Who were the Dacians? Are the people who live today in Romania. Quite a feat to wrap a bas-relief and to tell a story in a column that is declining in circumference and make sure all the figures come out right. I'm not quite sure how they did that. Originally, this would have had a statue on top of the Emperor Trajan, and it was replaced by a pope who pulled Trajan down and put up a statue of St. Peter in the Christian period. The part that remains today is only a small portion of it. There we see it right there, in this enormous building in which two law courts could operate simultaneously with the libraries on either side. There's a view of it in what remains. There is the column. There are the markets that we see. Mussolini lived right here and constructed this enormous street that connected the Piazza Venezia here down to the Colosseum so that he could actually hang out of his balcony window and watch these military parades as they go by. This reconstruction here is showing then the library that we see here, which operated pretty much like a sort of 19th century library where you would go, you wouldn't check books out and take them home. You would go and you would check out a book and you would sit there and read the book or do whatever. Adjacent to that were those great markets, which we'll come to in a moment. But I want to go back to the early period of Rome here at that river crossing at the foot of the Palatine over here and the Capitoline right there. Down in this valley floodplain of the Tiber, which was called the Forum Boarium, or the cattle market. Bovine comes from that word, boar, and it actually consisted eventually of two markets. This was the main vegetable market, and this was the main meat market of the city all through the imperial age. These two temples here, the Temple of Portunus and the Temple of Hercules Victor, still remain. Up then on the Viminal, we see a section drawing here of the markets, the covered markets that Trajan built, completed by Hadrian, designed by Apollodorus. Number 5 is actually an interior shopping mall. And then 4 is the street called the Via Biberatica, which is probably the best preserved street, Roman street, that we have, thanks to Mussolini, who actually excavated all of this. That's what it looks like today. You're looking from the Basilica Ulpia over to the markets. They would not have been visible at the time the basilica actually existed. You would have had, unless you had gotten on the roof. And then this is that interior market that we see with these extraordinary concrete and brick groin vaults that contain fine goods that could be damaged, like silk and other things. And I've always been partial to this building, not only because I believe it is one of the most complex buildings that we have from this period anywhere in the world, really extraordinary engineering feat and a great work of architecture, actually. But also because you can imagine then that at the time that it's built, let's say when Rome is really hitting on all cylinders, sometime around 150 of the Common Era, 150 AD, you would have had luxury goods here, the most extraordinary luxury goods in the world, from all over the world. By the 7th century, there are people living in here and there are pigs and chickens running around, right? Something to do with the decline of the city. This is the Via Biberatica, and you can see exactly how it worked. You had shop fronts that opened out, and then storage areas, and then on the left side, actually, they opened out into that covered market. This is a view of the street, the Via Biberatica, as it actually goes up the hill. Won't get into the complexity of it from a constructional standpoint, but believe me, it's quite difficult. The theaters, there are really 3 types. The first, the Hippodrome, associated originally with military parades, but converted by the middle of the Republic into entertainment, primarily in the form of horse racing. Professional teams, very much like the National Football League or something, would compete, and this, in the Great Circus, several circuses, but this one was, of course, the Great Circus. Now, I want to draw your attention to one thing here, because we'll see it again. This obelisk, which was brought back from Egypt, Heliopolis, and erected in the spina, the spine of the Circus Maximus. This fell, and we will encounter it again when Pope Sixtus V recovers it and re-erects it in the Piazza del Popolo in 1585. There's the Circus Maximus. Why the obelisk? Well, we'll come to this later, but anybody here ever been to Washington, D.C.? What's in the middle of the mall? An obelisk. These things have a kind of longevity. Originally sacred to the god Ra, Atun Ra. 2,000 years later, brought back as a spoil of war, erected in the spina of the Circus Maximus. Later falls into ruin, re-erected by a Christian pope in the 16th century as an example of sort of the triumph of his religion over the pagan world. Later, emptied out of all of its meaning, it becomes actually the sort of 0 milepost of the United States, in a sense, a monument to the founder. It even holds a radio tower on top of the old Bank of America building at North Avenue and Peachtree. These things have a strange longevity. There's even a midget version up here somewhere, and says you're entering Buckhead on the sidewalk. It's kind of weird, I think. This is an archaeological map by Rodolfo Lanciani, done in the late 19th century, in which he is mapping, overlaying the 19th century city on top of the classical ruins that he can identify, one of which is this large Greek theater built by Pompey. This was the one that broke the ban against Greek theaters. It was huge. It sat probably at 25 to 30,000 people. And the black pieces that you see here actually still remain structurally. And those of you who have been on that study abroad program know, because your hotel was built into the carcass of that theater. Even the elevator shaft is trapezoid because it's all aiming at the orchestra. Other towns had these theaters, of course. This is Pompeii on the top. Large versions for outdoor entertainment, plays, and then small versions for musical performances that were called an Odeon. And we see in the travelers maps of the Athenian Agora, for example, that in the Roman period, an Odeon was added into the center of the orchestra of the city of Athens. Now, originally, these theaters, of course, which were religious buildings in the ancient Greek world, had actually become completely secular. Yet they retained, interestingly enough, their palaestra, which was originally the sanctuary of the god. In the case of Ostia, as we saw last lecture, this was converted into a commodities market. And at Pompeii, it was converted into the gladiator barracks. And in some cases, they were converted into public gardens with restaurants and other kinds of things for refreshment between acts of a play. And then the third type, Greek theater being the second type, the third type is the arena, which is really sort of two Greek theaters that are sort of put together, forming this ellipse. And this was associated, of course, with mock battles of various kinds, in other words, gladiatorial combat. A remarkable building, took 10 years to build, begun by Vespasian, completed the year after his death by his son Titus. Known properly as the Theater of Vespasian, it sat 55,000 people, and it had a retractable roof. Not only did it have a retractable roof, it had a hollowed-out floor where this was covered with wood, and then sand would be placed on top of that, and then these were places where animals could be brought in with elevators, and they would pop up into the arena.